Schönen guten Tag, liebe Seherinnen und Hörer des YouTube-Kanals von International. Hier spricht wieder Fritz Edlinger. In hochsommerlicher Hitze produzieren wir ein Video nach dem anderen. Ich bitte um Nachsicht, Verständnis dafür, aber die internationalen Ereignisse zwingen uns einfach dazu. Es gibt wahnsinnig viel, was sich ereignet und wo wir meinen, dass wir auch unseren Kommentar dazu geben sollten, beziehungsweise wie auch heute wiederum Kommentare anderer, die uns äußerst wichtig erscheinen, weitergeben. Wir werden heute im Anschluss an dieses kurze Intro ein ungefähr einstündiges Gespräch in englischer Sprache weiterleiten, das auf dem YouTube-Kanal des in Wien ansässigen Internationalen Instituts für den Frieden, International Institute for Peace, veröffentlicht worden ist. Und das ein Gespräch zwischen Professor Heinz Gärtner, der sowohl bei IIB als auch bei uns in international tätig ist, mit einem sehr erfahrenen, jahrzehntelangen US-amerikanischen Diplomaten geführt hat. Und zwar handelt es sich um unter anderem den früheren US-Botschafter bei der NATO. Sein Name ist Robert E. Hunter. Sie sprechen wenige Tage nach dem jüngsten Kongress der NATO in Vilnius und die ganze Welt hat ja auf diesen Kongress auch gewartet. Es wurden sehr viele Hoffnungen, auch sowohl von der Ukraine bis hin zu Beitritt zur NATO, als auch vom Rest der Welt und auch vom Rest der 31 Akteure, also Mitglieder der NATO, erwartet. Und die beiden Experten führen ein Gespräch, das den Anlass dieses Gipfels hernimmt und auch einfach die historische Entwicklung, wie es zum Ukraine-Konflikt gekommen ist, die historische Entwicklung auch vor diesem Konflikt mit berücksichtigt. Für mitteleuropäische Ohren in Kurzfassung überraschend, für manche, die sich die inneramerikanischen Diskussionen genauer ansehen, nicht mehr ganz so. Es ist nämlich interessant, dass wirklich eine beträchtliche Anzahl von US-amerikanischen hochrangigen Spezialisten, frühere Minister, frühere führende Journalisten, Botschafter, inzwischen die Politik, die sie noch vor wenigen Jahren selbst als weisungsgebundene, mehr oder minder Beamte realisieren mussten, in Frage stellen und meinen, dass da und dort durchaus strategisch entscheidende Fehler gemacht worden ist. Und um das kurz zu resümieren, das lange Gespräch, zum Beispiel für mitteleuropäische, vor allem für ukrainische Ohren und Augen, überraschend oder auch nicht überraschend, für manche enttäuschend, ist eine der wesentlichen Aussagen vom Botschafter Hunter in seinem Gespräch, dass die Chancen der Ukraine auf einen Beitritt zur NATO eigentlich sehr schlecht sind. Er vergleicht das auch mit dem berühmten Jahr 2008, wo also auf dem NATO-Gipfel in Bukarest sogar von den USA der Beitritt von der Ukraine als möglich bezeichnet wurde und man eigentlich die Ukraine damals schon eingeladen hat. Das hat sich völlig geändert. Hunter resümiert es erstens, dass die Ukraine in vielen Aspekten einfach nicht beitrittsfähig ist. Und zudem meint er, dass auch unter den 31 momentanen NATO-Mitgliedern, wenn Schweden endgültig beigetreten sein wird, sind es 32, darunter sehr viele europäische Staaten, auch europäische Kleinstaaten. Und er meint, unter diesen 31 oder auch 32 Staaten wird es nie eine einstimmige Zustimmung zu einem Beitritt der Ukraine geben. Das ist ein interessantes Gespräch. Es ist auch eine interessante Aussage, die sich manchmal selbst bei uns in den mitteleuropäischen, in den europäischen Medien, auch vor allem in den deutschsprachigen Medien, doch sehr anders anhört. Ich darf mich beim Institut für internationale Politik, natürlich auch bei Heinz Gärtner, nochmals recht herzlich bedanken. Erstens, dass Heinz Gärtner die Initiative zu diesem Gespräch ergriffen hat und dass das IIB uns erlaubt hat und zugestimmt haben, dass wir dieses Gespräch auch voll inhaltlich, ohne irgendwelche Kürzungen auf unserem YouTube-Kanal veröffentlichen. Ich glaube, es ist wichtig, ich glaube, man soll sich dieses Gespräch genau in Ruhe anhören. Es ist wirklich ein ganz hochrangiger und kompetenter Spezialist, der dann auch manche historische Details auch für historische Kenner sehr genau nochmals resümiert und beschreibt. Und als Österreicher zum Abschluss auch ein Bonmot, das doch etwas mehr als ein Bonmot ist, weil wir auch gerade in den letzten Tagen und Wochen und Monaten in Österreich ja eine mehr oder minder heftige Diskussion über die österreichische Neutralität gehabt haben, über den Beitrag, den das neutrale Österreich, der Kleinstaat Österreich in den internationalen Beziehungen leisten könnte. Und es ist also doch ein interessantes Bonmot, zumindest wenn also Robert Hunter am Abschluss meint, es wäre eigentlich an der Zeit, darüber nachzudenken, einen neuen zweiten Wiener Kongress in Wien zu veranstalten, nämlich der letzte 1815 nach den Napoleonischen Kriegen, hat immerhin für Europa über viele Jahre, eigentlich Jahrhunderte, eine stabile Sicherheitsordnung und politische Ordnung erbracht. Und er meint, das wäre ein Anlass, sich daran zu erinnern, dass man bleibende Lösungen, stabile Lösungen sicherlich nicht auf dem Schlachtfeld, sondern halt mühsam, aber sinnvoll im Konferenzsaal erreichen sollte. In diesem Sinn herzlichen Dank für das heutige Zusehen, für das Öffnen unseres Kanals und viel Interesse bei diesem Video, bei diesem Gespräch. Ich glaube, es gibt eine Menge Aspekte, die einem aufmerksamen Hörer oder einer aufmerksamen Seherin zum Nachdenken geben sollten. In diesem Sinn alles Gute und bis zum nächsten Mal.
I want to welcome you to the YouTube channel of the International Institute for Peace. I am Heinz Gärtner. Today is July 14, 2023. Today's topic is the NATO summit in Vilnius. Today's guest is Robert Hunter. Robert Hunter has an excellent knowledge on NATO from inside, but also from outside. He was US ambassador to NATO in the 90s, and also he served on the National Security Council staff. From outside, he was a senior advisor of the think tank, the RAND Corporation, and he also was director of the Center for Transatlantic Security Studies at the National Defense University. He regularly also contributes to the publications of the Quincy Institute, and you can see him regularly on the TV stations in CNN and Al Jazeera. So the NATO summit is over. I briefly, when it comes to Ukraine, I briefly summarize the results. NATO did not promise Ukraine a timetable for membership, but it pledged, member states of NATO pledged new and more military and financial aid. But Ukraine did not get hard security guarantees like it would be enshrined in Article 5 of NATO, what President Zelensky wished for. So what does this result mean for the war? So we have continuous military and financial aid. So, and there's always the danger that the military escalation would move into Russia proper. That it was NATO wants to avoid by all circumstances. So, Robert, what is your prediction? So, is there a danger that this gap will come ever closer, more military aid, and at the same time escalation to Russia and more involvement of NATO?
Well, thank you, Heinz. It's a privilege once again to be involved with you and with your people. Let me start by saying happy 14 Juillet. This is Bastille Day in France, and maybe both of us would wish we were in Paris now for all of the celebrations. Let me just say, with regard to your question, you are absolutely right that the desire is to support Ukraine in its military effort to stop and then roll back to the extent possible the Soviet incursion into Ukraine, but at the same time to avoid escalation to something that could be far worse. I'm not even going to talk about nuclear weapons. I think that is not something that either side really would contemplate, despite what Mr. Putin has said at various times. But there is always a danger of things getting out of control. There is an old saying, the toughest things is to predict is about the future. And the weaponry that is going to be given now to Ukraine, which is going to be of a higher order of capability, could lead the Ukrainians to miscalculate or to avoid the strictures that are very clearly being placed on it, especially by the United States, and try to reclaim everything that they have already lost. And then who knows what the Russians would do. So it is going to be a balance, but I expect it to go on for a considerable time. And regrettably, if I may reach for an historical parallel, this is like the Second Battle of the Somme in 1916, in which there were lots of civilian casualties, and they were all French. The casualties in this war, except for some people who are in Russian-occupied areas who have a Russian background, the casualties are all Ukrainian, the civilian casualties. So we have a situation right now of virtual stalemate, and the real issue in the short term, therefore, is how do you move from virtual stalemate to a situation in which both sides would be willing to negotiate. And right now, neither side is, at least neither side says that it is.
Yeah, you're talking about stalemate. So that was, of course, it is one scenario that the stalemate will remain. So, and we know this, you're bringing analogies. We know this from history. Where the armies stand, there will be a division. So we know this from the end of the Second World War, and we know this from the divided Germany, and also in Korea. So you have a permanent division, and there is one possibility that we have a permanent division of Ukraine for a very long time if you have this scenario. So what would that mean for NATO membership? that would mean that NATO would probably or not take in a truncated Ukraine, not the whole Ukraine, but a truncated Ukraine. If this happens, of course, that means a de facto recognition of the occupation of the other territories which are occupied by Russia. First question, would NATO do this? Second scenario is we have a permanent fighting until all Russian troops leave Ukrainian territory. That can take a very, very long time. So that would mean that Ukraine is now much further away during the war from NATO membership than it was in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, when there was still the peace and the possibility that I might get a membership action plan sometime in the future. Over two questions. Separation, truncated Ukraine, would NATO accept? Could NATO accept this? Second, permanent fighting for a very, very long time that Ukraine can become a NATO member.
Well, first, I don't think the idea of perpetual war is something that either side is going to want to tolerate, or outsiders who might at some point have some influence with. The big problem of influence is how to get Mr. Putin to recognize that he's not going to be able to achieve what he tried to achieve. I don't expect, and here I'm going out on a limb, that at any point Ukraine will recover Crimea, which incidentally is only in Ukraine by accident if one goes back to the history of 1952 when Khrushchev moved it from the Russian Soviet Federal Republic of the Soviet Union over to the Ukrainian side. So that was an accident. Now, in regard to NATO membership, I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, Ukraine is farther away from membership than it was potentially in 2008. After all, it was made very clear that even having a roadmap to membership will not happen until after the war comes to an end. The US president made this very clear. And of course, the 800-pound gorilla in NATO is and will continue to be the United States. Now, I am a skeptic compared to conventional wisdom that Ukraine will ever join NATO, no matter what size or shape it happens to be. And we can talk about what that might look like later if you'd like, because it takes consensus. All 31 countries have to agree. What will happen, what would happen, as always happens at NATO, is the Secretary General lays before the Council what's called a decision sheet. This would be Ukraine to become a NATO member. And then any single ally can speak out against it. And that's the end of it. And at this point in history, I cannot imagine that all 31 countries will be, under any conceivable right now circumstance, be willing to accept responsibility to Ukraine for implementing Article 5, which, as you know, has two parts. Number one, it's aggression against any one country is considered as aggression against all. That's in effect a declaration of war. And what Mr. Biden and everybody else is trying, except some people in some countries in the East, are trying to avoid, is a direct war with Russia. It is a war now, but there's still the fiction that everybody's prepared to accept everywhere, that this is not an actual war. But if you invoke Article 5 with Ukraine in, and the fighting is still going on, you're at war. Secondly, of course, Article 5 does not require anybody to do anything. It merely says each country in NATO, acting according to its constitutional processes, will decide what to do about it, to send, to become involved military if they want, but they don't have to. And there are some countries that would never want to do this. But I don't believe that even after the war is over, that 31 members of NATO, then be 32 with Sweden, are going to say, yes, we will give an Article 5 commitment to Ukraine. Certainly not before the war ends. Back in 2008, that condition wasn't applied. I don't think the Allies meant it back in 2008. It was just a convenience because the American president, George W. Bush, wanted to push for the membership of Ukraine and Georgia. Remember that, and Georgia. And several allies said, no, come on, we're not prepared to do that. So they came up with this formulation that said, Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. For most NATO members, that meant never. That's off sometime in the distant future. We're not going to have to think about it. But that's now been made formal, that you don't even have to think about joining NATO at least until after the war comes to an end. And then there will be conditions to be considered. The conditions, incidentally, were applied early on to try to help potential new members become good democracies, to deal with internal problems like corruption. And one of the striking things about Ukraine, even since the war began, is they've done nothing about corruption. Nothing about it. It is not as corrupt as Russia, but it's certainly not as uncorrupt as I think any of the existing NATO allies. And also another condition is to get your military up to speed, and Ukraine is moving very rapidly on that. Some people argue it's already the most, the strongest military in outside potentially of Russia in Europe. Now, let's face one thing: there are no conditions for joining NATO. Except for one. The only condition for joining NATO, the only one, is that all NATO allies are prepared to apply, if need be, Article 5. And as I'm arguing right now, certainly, and now this is out in the open and agreed, that can't happen while the current war is going on. There will be no Ukrainian membership before that. And unless Russia does something that so far it hadn't shown a willingness or ability to do, it's not going to happen while the war is going on. And afterwards, we shall see. But I don't believe, again, that all 31 countries will be prepared in the event of a renewal of the war to go to war against Russia. Final point, back in the 1990s, we had to figure out how, as NATO was expanding, to prevent provoking Russia into some kind of hostile action. Ukraine, we got rid of the concept of buffer states or sphere of influence. Sphere of influence we still deny, but Ukraine is going to be seen by the West and by Russia as a buffer state. I don't want to use the term, but that's how it's going to be seen. And the fact that that was already clear in 1997, when NATO decided to take in its first 3 members, with the prospect of others coming in, and when NATO signed with the Russian Federation in May of 1997, the so-called NATO-Russia Founding Act, which has an extraordinary range of cooperative measures, in order to compensate Ukraine, not going to get membership through the membership process that was started, and it's going to be not going to be consigned to any Russian sphere of influence. So we came up with a thing called the NATO-Russia Council, NATO-Russia Charter, and the final bits of which I negotiated with the then Ukrainian ambassador to Belgium, who also worked with NATO, who then became foreign minister, Boris Tereshchuk, who very distinguished Ukrainian diplomat. But that, in effect, ratified Ukraine as a buffer state. Now, at the end of the Vilnius summit, the Allies decided to create a Ukraine commission, the NATO-Ukraine Commission. I'm sorry, not commission. Council, which was to permit Ukraine to sit around the table as an equal with NATO. Let me be very frank about it. In the 1997 charter, there was agreed to be a commission, NATO-Ukraine Commission, which would allow Ukraine at any point it wanted to call the allies together and meet with them to talk about what its concerns or its security were. Frankly, the difference between the Commission and the Council, which we agreed this week, is more in the name than anything else. It has more technical quality to it, but it's really the same thing. It was, again, a compensation to Ukraine for not giving it what it wanted, which was membership. We can talk about why that didn't happen and what was going on and why even the discussion about it, I believe, was a bad thing for the future of Ukraine and the future of NATO security.
Yeah, you talked about what happens once the war ends. Of course, there is already a debate about this. It will affect the NATO-Russian relations, the NATO-Ukraine relations, the Ukraine-Russian relations. So that will be a very complicated mix of political decisions. So they are under discussion. In a nutshell, what happens to European security after the war? Will we have European security with Russia, without Russia, or against Russia? There is, of course, this scenario, what happens if it is against Russia. That what means that we will have an isolated Russia. So in some scenarios, I guess yourself mentioned that in one of your articles, could be Versailles 1919 situation, which might even be worse, what is going to happen in Russia. Another scenario would be that the war and the isolation would leave a big North Korea in the east of Europe, a big North Korea with nuclear weapons. Russia, that the only means they have to is to blackmail the Europeans with nuclear weapons. Economically, they are very weak already. Russia will be weaker, even much weaker after the war. So that would be the doomsday scenario. Of course, there are other scenarios which are discussed. We had during the height of the Cold War, there was the CSE Helsinki conference, which tried to mitigate the high tension and reduce the arms race at that time. Another historical analogy would be Vienna 1815, the concert. So this would be the more integrative scenario. So we have the scenario of isolation or the scenario of somehow partial integration of Russia. So what is your take on this global European scenario after the war?
Wow. One thing I think is clear, Heinz, is for your institute and other institutes, we're not going to go out of business. It's going to be an awful lot to think about and look at. If I had a magic wand to end the war, I would come up with a formula like Minsk II. I would call it Minsk III, which would in effect, and this is really reaching for it, accepting Ukrainian sovereignty, certainly over the areas outside Crimea and probably, and ideally including Crimea, Ukrainian sovereignty, but some form of rigorous autonomy for the areas that are Russian-speaking, Russian culture, and the like. In effect, the Russians would have a primus inter pares within those areas. That would be my kind of scenario on that. Now, with regard to the long range with Russia, of all the historical analogies, the one I like best is Vienna 1815, or even Westphalia 1648. But I don't see that happening. But you put your finger on, if you're going to reach to the long term, let us assume the war comes to an end. Let us assume that Ukraine is reconciled to whatever the outcome is. Let us assume that Russia sees itself reconciled to what its concern was about NATO surrounding Russia. And I don't think we can totally ignore the Russian concerns about that, which were not just Putin, but Russian concerns general. You just can't do that in international politics. And if you look for another historical analogy on that, think about a thing called the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, which we still apply in the Western Hemisphere. We Americans, we didn't like Castro, we didn't like Noriega, we didn't like that guy who was in Nicaragua, who was back in power again, and we invaded Grenada, okay? So we apply the Monroe Doctrine. But and the Russians kind of want a Monroe Doctrine of its own, but it can't have it in terms of sphere of influence. That's already ruled out. But here is the long term, and I don't know what long term is, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Russia will not continue to be supine. Its economy will recover, let's say absent war. They have a huge amount of natural resources. They have had a very good educational system when it comes, at least, to what we in the West now call STEM, which science, technology, I don't know, engineering and mechanics, or whatever STEM, or mathematics, whatever STEM means. That is the hard sciences. And it will recover. And it will be a major player. That's something that we understood when the Cold War came to an end. We understood the Soviet Union has lost. It was the largest collapse of any internal empire and external empire, Eastern Europe, in peacetime in all of history. Nothing like that happened. So, okay, so here was Russia on the floor back in 1991, Christmas night, when it formally came to an end, and other republics of the 15 republics all went independent. Whether that was a good idea or not, historically, not even worth talking about. That included Ukraine becoming independent as along with the others. Now, what to do about it? Now, you mentioned the Treaty of Versailles, and there were smart people in the George H.W. Bush administration. And I like to think there were some smart people in the Clinton administration, which I served during the most important period during the Clinton administration for 4.5 years, when we put together the new architecture for security in Europe based fundamentally upon what happens with NATO and other things. And I like to think I was one of the leading architects, and certainly one of the leading negotiators of all that. But we look back to the Treaty of Versailles, and you can look this up, anybody can. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, the so-called War Guilt Clause, Germany was forced to accept that, which put all the guilt for World War I on to Germany, which was obviously nonsense. The guilt, that is responsibility for starting the war, was on the backs of a lot of countries, including, if I may say so, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, France, Britain, all shared responsibility along with Germany. Well, the War Guilt Clause was put in order to create a legal basis to demand reparations from Germany to rebuild in parts of other countries, most insisted upon by France, but also by the United Kingdom, and supported, obviously, because it was in the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States was signatory. The United States went along with that. Well, what happened? This was used by German revanchists, including an Austrian named Adolf Hitler, as evidence that Germany was being punished for something it was only partly responsible for, and that it was being done down And it was one of the arguments that Hitler used in his campaign for the Nazis to come to power and then to do all the things that we saw him do, beginning with the remilitarization of the Rhineland, to going back into the Ruhr, and then all the other things that we've seen, which your country suffered terribly through the Anschluss of which preceded the partition of Czechoslovakia. So we were bound and determined not to repeat that, and that meant whatever we were going to do to build security post-Cold War could not push Russia away, could not do that, because that could lead at some point, when Russia recovered. At the time, people used to joke, it's Guatemala with nuclear weapons. Well, that was a bad thing to say, but most people didn't. And so as we built the new security built on NATO, we developed first a thing called Partnership for Peace, which was open to all members of the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which, as you know, is based in Vienna. And at the time, it had 35 countries. I think it has 57 countries now, something like that. You'll know the exact number. But we said everybody could join Partnership for Peace, which was about transformations of militaries, helping countries in the East become democracies, help them have a basis to get on with economic regeneration, which was done through, I guess it was called the European, wasn't the European Union at that point. I can't remember, they keep changing their name as they had more members, was to help all these countries become better off. But at the time, Russia, like everybody else, members of OSCE, was offered a place. In fact, I was part of a team in 1994, which went from NATO headquarters to Moscow to negotiate with the Russian Federation its membership in the Partnership for Peace and the parallel Euro-Atlantic Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council, which I guess which still exists. The NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 created a special council with a special meeting facility between NATO and the Russians, in which NATO met together and decided a position and then talked to Russia. So it was, at that point, I guess it was 19 plus 1. Then in 2002, they augmented that to a full NATO-Russia Council, in which Russia sat around the table and still could, even though it's in abeyance at the moment, as an equal with the NATO allies, and any decision taken by the NATO-Russia Council about cooperation, about arms control, about all kinds of things, everybody had equal status, and everybody, the NATO members plus Russia, could veto if they wanted, just like NATO has the consensus principle. Now, further, in the effort so that Russia would not be pushed away, there were various economic things that were done. There were efforts to work with the Russian military. In fact, one of the things that is most striking in 1990, sorry to go on about this, but one has to know the history, how we got there. 1995, when the Bosnia War came to an end, and incidentally, Russia, along with the Finnish president, was helped negotiate, or at least provide the basis for negotiation, by supporting what became the Dayton Accords, which ended the Bosnia War. Okay, as part of that, there was created with UN sanction, and the reason Russia supported the end of the war is there was a United Nations Security Council resolution, and the reason they did not support the later war against Serbia over Kosovo, 1998, is because there was no United Nations Security Council resolution. So the Russians saw this to be an illegal war, whereas the Bosnian War was considered by Russia to be a legal war. Okay. Comes to an end under Dayton, created a thing called the Implementation Force, I4, to go into Bosnia all parts of Bosnia, which was the effort was to have a unitary government, and they're still working at that, but at least nobody's died since 1995, except a few minor incidents, which is a huge achievement. And the Russians said, we would like to be part of this I4. We'd like to. So Mr. Grachev came to NATO headquarters, and there was a meeting in my office as NATO ambassador with the Russian defense minister, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, Bill Perry, and the commander of NATO and U.S. forces, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, George Jowan, four-star U.S. general, met in my office. And Grachev said, we want to be part of this I4. Come on. This will be like the good old days meeting at the Elba in April 1945, where the United States and the Soviet Union, the two big participants in the Second World War against Germany, came together and shook hands and all of that. And they were the two big countries that made the arrangements after that, though the British and then the French were also involved in. So, but Grachev said, no, but there is a problem. We said, what's the problem? He said, we cannot put Russian forces under NATO command. You got to understand that we can't do that. NATO is the historic enemy. So George Jowan brought out some big charts that he had made up, and they showed various things. And it showed SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, commanding I4, and then commanding the various NATO allies, plus a bunch of others, neutral countries and others. I don't know whether Austria was part of it.
Yeah.
You were or were not?
Yes.
Yes, you were. Okay.
Yeah.
He said, and the rest said, we can't do that. He said, well, let me show you something else. Here's the United States European Command, okay, run by an American general, and we can descend from that, and Russia could be part of I4, but not under NATO command, but under American command. And Grachev said, that's fine. That's fine. We don't mind being under American commands, back to the elbow where it makes us look like a big power, and fine. So they agreed on that. Russia sent its very best troops to I4, worked very effectively with I4. The Americans and the Russians worked together. I remember one occasion in which there were some Americans who were in a facility, and they were being surrounded by some Serbs who were there. Or maybe it was the Bosnian Serbs. And the United States got on the phone and called the Russians, and the Russians came to the rescue. Okay, but so it did work. Where it changed was at the end of the 1990s. Even though there had been the NATO-Russia Founding Act, the NATO-Ukraine Charter, and look at the NATO-Ukraine Founding Act. It's got some amazing principles, and it's got 19 areas of cooperation. It's a fantastic document. Fantastic document. Signed at the Élysée on the 27th of May, 1997. The French were skeptical about joining this, and so I said, why don't we agree to have it signed in France at the Élysée? And at that point, all the French objections went away because they got a chance to host the signing. Well, then, beginning with NATO going into Kosovo, and then a series of things happened. The people in the United States government who understood you cannot have a repetition of the Treaty of Versailles. You cannot cast Russia into the outer darkness. You cannot say Russia, largest part of the former Soviet Union, lost the war, so to hell with them. They're going to come back, and we need to treat them with respect. Those people in the U.S. government left, a new group came in, and they said, oh, Russia lost the war, who cares about them? So the United States started taking some unilateral actions. For one thing, it abrogated the ABM Treaty of 1972. That seemed logical. Well, we don't need it anymore. There's no longer a nuclear standoff with the Soviet Union and Russia, so get rid of it. Well, except the problem was that was one of the few things that enabled Russia to say, see, we're still a big boy. We did it anyway. Then, for a variety of reasons, as you will know, in the middle of the 2000s, the United States with its allies, but particularly the United States, decided to put some anti-ballistic missiles in Central Europe. And why? To defend against North Korean missiles and Iranian missiles if and when they came into being. Now, I'm not a physicist, but the physicist said, well, you have to put these things in Central Europe in order to protect against a North Korean attack, including against the United States. I don't know where that came from. Adding Iran to it was not because they had missiles. It was because the Israel lobby wanted it, okay? That was American domestic politics. Well, okay, the Russians said, hey, wait a second. What about our nuclear deterrent? This can be directed against our nuclear deterrent. We said, no, you know that's just a tiny little thing. And the United States was right. There's no threat to the Russian nuclear deterrent. But that was not the point. The point was this was taking place in former members of the Warsaw Pact. And it was once again showing that Russia was nobody. It was nobody. But we went ahead anyway. And there were some other things. The Russians didn't abide by all parts of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, so we withdrew from it. The Russians weren't abiding by all parts of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and so it was put into abeyance by the Russian side. So by 2008, the relationship with Russia was in not good shape, because a bunch of people did stupid things. We did most of the stupid things, Treaty of Versailles, and the Russians did some stupid things as well. And there was a warning. I'll stop at this point. Putin came to the Munich Security Conference in 2007. And said, like, everything I've said is on the internet. You can look it up. And Putin made a speech in which he said, you're disrespecting us. Come on. You can't, that's not the way you should treat others. Now, the American president I like, and I can get along with him, but you can't, you got to take us seriously. I was in the room when it happened. Everybody laughed at him, his speech, except Angela Merkel, who was one of the smartest European leaders, most effective, and following on the tradition of Chancellor Kohl, who had as much as anybody else to put some of the original architecture, post-Cold War architecture together, but people didn't listen to him. And then it got to what I've already described in 2008, not just for Ukraine, for Georgia, and that played into Russian paranoia, but also played into Mr. Putin's arguments at home. See what's being done to us. Now, it wasn't being done then, wasn't going to be done maybe forever. Well, there was another little thing that happened. I denounced that immediately. I said, come on, don't you understand what you just did? Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. I said, that's the moment of commitment. That's the moment in which you say, legally, formally, technically, by NATO law, that's saying these countries are NATO members. It's not what it meant, but that's what the word said, okay? Well, that's how the Russians read it. Another country that read it that way was Georgia, Mr. Saakashvili. So he says, oh, I'm going to be a NATO member. So I'm going to get back the areas of my country that have been occupied by breakaway parts of my country and supported by Russia. Abkhazia was part of it, but South Ossetia. He says, so I'm going to get back South Ossetia. And so he sent Georgian troops into South Ossetia, even though an assistant secretary of state, Dan Fried, telephoned the foreign minister just beforehand. He said, don't do this. And in fact, Dan Fried will confirm that. Go ask him. I did not so long ago. He said, yeah, I called the foreign minister and said, don't do this. Well, Saakashvili said, who cares what you think? He went into South Ossetia believing that NATO would have its back. NATO said, we're not going to do anything. The Americans gave them some military aid, and everything, but nobody went to war for Georgia. In effect, showing the decision, 2008, didn't mean anything. At the time, I said, gosh, I hope we don't do something stupid with regard to Ukraine. Well, we had the problems which you will know about in 2014, in which there was a legally elected president of Ukraine who was pro-Russia. not a great idea. And he abrogated an agreement that had been worked out with the European Union, which would have been a great thing for Ukraine, and frankly, it shouldn't have mattered to Russia. And so there was the rioting, and it took place in the Maidan, which is, I don't know if you've been to Kyiv, it's right in the center of Kyiv. A lot of people got killed, particularly by people on the non-pro-Russian side. And the president left the country to go to Russia, and then they had to come up with somebody new. So a different American Assistant Secretary of State got on the telephone to the American ambassador in Kyiv on an open line and said, I think Charlie is the guy we would like to come into power. Okay? None of American business, all right? But it was represented by Russia as a coup. Well, you can debate that, but it was used by Putin as an excuse to go into Crimea and to the Donbass 3 or 4 weeks later. It was probably already reason to do it, but he had a nice excuse. Incidentally, if you want to hear about that effort to put our person in, it's on the website. The conversation was intercepted, probably by Russia. They put it on the internet. And the BBC has a wonderful website, which you can listen to it, and you can read the transcript. Okay, and so then we were off to the races, and then NATO did things at the Wales Summit and all of that. That, believe me, in no way does that justify what Putin did in 2022. In no way justifies any of the war crimes. No way justifies any of the brutality and the slaughter being undertaken by Mr. Putin. But it still leaves us with a problem. Not just how do you stop the war, stop the killing, and what does it look like in Ukraine afterwards, but what about down the road, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, in which Russia will again be a great power? And incidentally, it wouldn't matter who's president. Putin can die of a natural death or get assassinated. Any Russian leader would want to do that. And we got to think about that. And that's why I think maybe the worst thing that came out of the Vilnius summit was when the American president, in effect, formally declared a new Cold War. And in effect, appropriated into the Vilnius communique elements, effectively, of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, I understand why it was done and all that kind of stuff, but nobody was prepared to face up to the potential consequences 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I'm too old, and you're younger than me, but you're getting on there. I don't think we'll have to face it, but the generation that comes after us is going to have to face that. Well, good luck to them.
I have a final question. You said that in 10, 15, 20 years from now, Russia might revive and be a great power again. But of course, there's in the US, not only in the US, also in Europe, there are some observers who rather say Russia will disintegrate, so fall apart, that the US can concentrate on China. And of course, in the final communique of NATO, China plays a big part here as well. And also Article 5 under some circumstances is applied to China, because when it comes to the communique would say malicious cyber and hybrid activities of the People's Republic of China, what it might invoke Article 5. That means that NATO would be drawn into Asia, but also on the other hand, if you apply Article 5, Asia and the confrontation US-China might be drawn into Europe, because you have, of course, NATO members, most of them are Europeans. So, of course, we all discuss the situation of Taiwan. And there was a recent survey of the European Council on Foreign Relations among European Union citizens. And they would say the question, if it comes to a conflict between China and the US over Taiwan, would you side with China, with the US, or would stay neutral? So 62 to 65% would stay, I would say, I'd rather stay neutral, European citizens. We don't want to be drawn in a war that is not ours. So was it a good idea to apply, already it was in the last communique, I say, to apply Article 5 to cyber activities of China? And we know how hard it is to attribute a cyber attack to an enemy. So at the end, it would be a political decision by the NATO Council. So it is, because you can always say our intelligence has told us, we have to decide. So the Europeans would not have the capacity really to read the pictures and the information of the intelligence. So Europeans would be drawn into the conflict if it really comes shove into push. What is your take now? Is it a good idea to include Article 5 to apply security commitments, and if China is involved?
Well, first, you ask all the right questions and have the right perspective. I wish you'd been in the U.S. National Security Council helping to plan the Vilnius summit, but you weren't, unfortunately. Incidentally, I should mention, it's not just 5, 10, 20 years now with regard to Russia. It is already getting engaged in places like the Middle East, which we and others have very important interests. And they are going to be involved in Africa and elsewhere. So even in the short term, you can't write off Russia. With regard to Russia disintegrating, and yes, there are people who would like to see Russia disintegrate and want to see this war prosecuted to the overthrow of Putin and the disintegration of Russia. I would say this, be extremely careful what one hopes for. I am not sure any of us would welcome the plethora of republics and countries and interest groups and ethnic groups and everything that would be in a disintegrated Russia. I think we would wish we would even have the old Soviet Union back again. So that's something that is the height of insanity, I think, for people to want that. Now, my reading of the communique, maybe I read it wrong, is yes, they repeated the concern collectively about what China is up to, but there were actually very modest steps that were considered that would happen. Now, one sidebar to this, I should say, is there was a discussion in the communique about things that are not what we call kinetic war, that is troops crossing frontiers, like cyber, et cetera, that might rise to the level of invoking Article 5. That would apply to Europe. And the word is might, would have to be considered. And remember again, all decisions at NATO are taken by consensus. So if there were ever an effort to say, here is what we need to do about China, and we're going to do it through the North Atlantic Council, any country of the 32 can say no. That's the end of it. And lots of countries would listen to Europol and they would say no. Incidentally, there's another thing about trying to apply Article 5 to China, which is a non-starter. It's called Article 6. Article 6 says, and this was written specifically to please the United States in 1949. Article 6 says, where does Article 5 apply? It applies in Europe, North America, and the North Atlantic, north of the Tropic of Cancer. And at the time, it also applied to Algeria because that was part of metropolitan France, and the treaty had to be tidied up when Algeria went independent. But it can't apply to anything beyond the northwest quadrant of Europe. You couldn't cite Article 5 with regard to China. You'd have to rewrite the treaty. Now, individual countries might be prepared to join with the United States if, God forbid, it came to some kind of conflict. The British have an aircraft carrier that may even be out there right now. The French don't want to get left out when there's fighting going on. But for the rest of the Allies, they're not going to have any part of it. And I think it is a mistake to import into NATO these concerns rather than doing it either separately, or if you're talking about the economic relationship with China, in which various countries are backing away from it, trying to sever supply chains, being more careful about that. That's really a business of individual countries or the European Union. But for NATO, that was thrown in there merely to please the United States in order to help us not lose the idea of some kind of pivot of Western power to the Far East. But what came out of this, I'll just be very blunt about it, the Vilnius decisions, which, and I was against, I thought even holding the summit was a bad thing because you have to have deliverables. And among the deliverables is now locking in a new Cold War. And that means, with all the decisions that were made, including the G7 decisions with regard to added military support for Ukraine, though to be discussed and decided, wasn't decided, it was saying, we're going to start talking about it right away tomorrow morning. I think literally tomorrow morning. You don't have an opportunity there for the United States to back away from its very, very heavy military involvement in Central Europe and against Russia, which is in there. The planning and all that is, in effect, the Cold War just moved east a few hundred kilometers, and also bringing in Finland and Sweden. Sweden's a throwaway because Russia would have to go through Finland before it gets to Sweden. The Swedes know that. I think the Finns were crazy to join NATO, but it's another matter because that just helps provoke the Russians later on to do something. But their choice. And in the heat of the moment, everybody said, "Come on, Finland, come on in." But that was their decision. I think it was the wrong one, but they didn't listen to me. Like nobody else listens to me on these things anymore, except maybe your audience. But the only country that can balance Russia, that can in fact militarily take on Russia, is the United States of America. That's always been true in the post-Cold War era, as it was in the Cold War. That's why when we had 9/11, United States being attacked, the first ever invocation of Article 5 was because we were attacked by terrorists. Was it because the Allies were worried about the terrorists coming and doing things in Europe and all that, and one for all and all for one? Yes, there was some terrorism in Europe. That's not why they did it. The European allies invoking Article 5, which we didn't propose. The Canadians proposed it. We said, "Oh, you want to do it? Go ahead and do it." It was because the Allies were worried we would become so distracted by Afghanistan and by terrorism that we'd forget about helping.
It was already out of continent. It was NATO out of continent already.
Well, no, but the United States is covered by Article 5. Okay, the United States is covered by Article 5, and in fact, NATO sent AWACS flying over the United States, but did not send anything except later on with the NATO force that went into Afghanistan, and NATO went in itself, but that was not an Article 5 thing. And the same happened that was when we put in the NATO force into Afghanistan. And the EU put in a force to Afghanistan as well, as you know. And one of the ironies is because NATO and the EU don't work together, and it don't work together much more in this communique. Big mistake, again, not to have NATO and the EU working more closely together. It's just few allies on both sides refuse to do it, but it's dumb, or it's dumb. If NATO wanted to work with the EU in Afghanistan, they would have to send a message back to Brussels. Somebody would have to walk it down the street to EU headquarters. they would have to send a message back to Afghanistan, to the EU, to enable the NATO and the EU, who are 15 meters apart, to work together. That's dumb. And the same thing happened with Iraq. The reason allies joined us, except for Germany and France, who were right, everybody else was wrong, in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and then joining the post-Iraq war force that was there, was not because they were worried about being attacked out of Iraq. It was because they were worried, once again, America would forget about Europe and America's responsibility for dealing with Russia. So what has been decided now is going to diminish the capacity of the United States financially and militarily to work in Asia, despite our $850 billion defense budget. So we're going too far in terms of what we actually need to do. And the United States has locked it in. Incidentally, maybe this is the final point. Austria is now surrounded by NATO. Austria and Switzerland are all by our little lonesomes, plus Ireland and Malta and Cyprus. That's the kind of thing. Not being members of NATO. I hope you don't feel so lonely there. One of the great ideas, and maybe it could be applied to Ukraine later on, is the 1955, remind me what it's called, Act, which was permanent neutrality for Austria, and which has worked very effectively. What is it called? State treaty.
Yeah, the state treaty, but it's separate to neutrality. We have the neutrality law, which is a constitutional law. The state treaty is separate, but it was both in 1955.
You have a little time for a little anecdote. I have a friend, I think he may be dead now, named Heinz Gärtner, who was in charge in the Bundes here of the implementation of things in regard to Austria not being allowed to have certain kind of weaponry, including missiles. And so when they wanted to buy an American anti-tank weapon, forbidden, they went to the Russians and said, we'd like to buy a few of your anti-tank weapons, but we can't do it because of this provision of the state treaty. The Russians said, oh, don't worry about that. We'll finesse that. You can buy some of our anti-tank weapons. And so Austria bought a few and then turned to the United States because it was now permitted and bought a lot. So, and in fact, if you look the war planning for Austria throughout the Cold War, coming up the Danube Valley, it was all oriented towards Soviet troops coming up from Hungary with the idea that Austria would, in effect, have to surrender, couldn't do this, but enough time would be bought for U.S. forces in Germany to come south and defend Ukraine. You guys are very smart, very clever.
I have to add another anecdote, which is true, because Austria's neutrality, and there was because you mentioned Hungary, there was this Hungarian uprising in 1956 that the Soviets suspected the Austrians to give safe haven to some of the insurgents and would threaten Austria. And then the Eisenhower government would respond. I saw it in several documents. Would respond and say, if Austrian neutrality is violated, that would be a case for a third world war. So that means that Eisenhower took Austria's neutrality very seriously because it was credible at that time. So it was a good security guarantee because it was respected also by the Americans. However,
wait a second, there was an exception that you may not even know about. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War, the United States wanted to send aircraft from Germany to help Israel and flew across Austria, didn't tell anybody, and the Russians kept their mouths shut.
Yeah. Robert, I hope our audience will very carefully listen to to our discussion, to your insightful presentations and ideas and knowledge. So thank you very much. It was really, really enlightening, and we all learned. We are always learning of you, and so thank you again. And we do it the next time as well, but we will not wait until the next NATO summit. We do it.
Well, Heinz, you keep up the good work, and think about a new conference of Vienna where we can settle the war over Ukraine.
Yeah, it will not be Helsinki, it will be Vienna next time. Okay, thank you, Robert.